Trump has used economic coercion as his tool of first resort when he wants to get anything, whether it's a trade deal with China or the EU, or in this case, actually adding new territory to the United States and Greenland. The first thing he thinks about is how do you use economic power to get what he wants.
Donald Trump has imposed a 10% tariff threat on Denmark over Greenland, which will kick into place from the 1st of February on all goods sent to the US. From the 1st of June, the tariffs will be bumped up to 25%. And the other countries caught in Trump's ire are Norway, Sweden, France, the UK, and others. The US president has said that the US has subsidised Denmark and the EU for many years, and he added it was time for Denmark to give back. So just how much damage will these tariffs cause? And will the EU capitulate to the president? I'd like to welcome Edward Fisher, Director of the Centre on Geo-Economic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and former State Department and Treasury Department official. Mr. Fisher, thank you so much for joining me. You're also the author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Could you give us a sense on these tariffs that Donald Trump has threatened to impose on NATO allies over Greenland?
So look, Donald Trump has used economic coercion as his tool of first resort when he wants to get anything, whether it's a trade deal with China or the EU, or in this case, actually adding new territory to the United States and Greenland. The first thing he thinks about is how do you use economic power to get what he wants. I think for the Europeans, in some ways, this has got to be reminiscent of what happened, about 6 or 8 months ago. And when you go back to last summer, when the Europeans were dealing with negotiating with Trump over the first wave of tariffs, the approach from the Europeans was to capitulate, was effectively to give in and agree to a lopsided trade deal in which the U.S. was able to put higher tariffs on Europe than the other way around, and Europe agreed to make major investments in the United States. I think if you juxtapose that with the way China responded, where China retaliated aggressively against Trump's tariff threats, I think the Chinese made off much better off than the Europeans did. So what I imagine is happening right now in European capitals, they're learning from the lessons of last summer's trade war and perhaps deciding that this time around it makes more sense to retaliate instead of capitulate.
Do we go with what I spoke about earlier on the show, the taco theory, Trump always chickens out?
Look, the biggest weakness that Trump has when it comes to economic warfare is that he does actually care about the U.S. economy. And we saw this again last April with the Liberation Day tariffs, when Trump imposed a 145% tariff on China and China retaliated by cutting off rare earth minerals to the United States. It tanked the U.S. stock market, and it raised fears that we would actually have a recession here in the United States. And what that shows is that while members of Congress or the rule of law may not be a check on Donald Trump's power, the stock market and the health of the U.S. economy has been a check on his power. And so I do think were the EU to retaliate aggressively through this anti-coercion instrument and markets to react, and you were to see a significant dip in equities prices here in the U.S., I do think that certainly raises the likelihood that Trump decides that this is just not worth it. The costs are too high, and he needs to seek some sort of face-saving way out.
Now, European leaders are accusing the president of blackmail. Is this what this is?
Look, I mean, to a certain extent, yes. The U.S., the reason why the United States has this amount of economic leverage over not just, businesses in Europe, but really all over the world, is that over many decades, companies opted in to a U.S.-led economic order, an economic system that's based on the U.S. dollar, that's based on technologies coming out of Silicon Valley. This is what created the choke points in the title of my book. These are parts of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes. Of course, businesses, countries would not have opted into this system if they thought it would soon be weaponized against them, that it would be used as a kind of sword of Damocles over any of their decision making. So for sure, it is a kind of blackmail. And I think if you sort of zoom out and think about what are the repercussions, if this is going to be the approach of the United States on an ongoing basis, you've got to imagine that even close allies like the UK are going to start hedging against U.S. economic power, trying to find alternatives to the dollar, alternatives to U.S. technologies, and that will reorder the entire global economy itself.
Now, President Trump claims that Russia and China both want Greenland. What are your views on that? Is there truth to this claim?
No, there's no truth to that claim at all. I mean, part of the reason there's such a small military presence on Greenland, including a very small U.S. military presence on Greenland, is that there has not been a significant military threat to the territory. It's not thinkable, really, for either China or Russia to seize Greenland. So I don't think we need to take that particularly seriously. I think the other thing that's worth noting is that Denmark has actually been one of the closest, if not the closest, security partners to the United States within NATO. They fought alongside the United States in Afghanistan, and lost many troops, as well as in Iraq. They've suffered a lot, in the name of sort of defending the United States. The United States already, just by virtue of its relationship with Denmark, could substantially ramp up our military presence on Greenland, right? The same way that the U.S. has military bases in all manner of other countries, including European countries, including countries in the Indo-Pacific. That's something we could do if the military threat was top of mind. I think this really comes down to Trump's desire to be seen in history as somebody who expanded the map of the United States. It's really in line with his desire for the Nobel Peace Prize, sort of someone who wants to etch his name in the history books. And I think the way he sees that is through this territorial conquest. I think the other thing to mention is that, Trump's approach to economic security, the idea that, we need all access to the minerals we need, but that we need to run our economy. Most of the time you would think, okay, well, you can do that through alliances. You can get minerals you need from Canada or other countries that we trust. For Trump, it's all been about onshoring, trying to do everything we possibly can in the United States. And I think that mentality also sometimes leads to a desire for imperialism and conquest.
Yeah, it's kind of trophy hunting on a geopolitical scale. I've just got a message in here from a listener. NATO was there for the USA on 9/11, and Denmark, pro rata, had more dead on Afghan soil than any other nation. So confirming what you were saying there. Now, more widely, you worked on the implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, and this week the Trump administration announced new sanctions against more than a dozen, I think, Iranian individuals and entities that it alleges are the architects of the regime's brutal crackdown on protesters. Now, Iran is already hugely isolated economically. Will this make any difference?
No, I don't believe it will. So, the reason Iran is in the throes of these protests right now and their economy is completely in a point of collapse, and really not dissimilar from where Venezuela has been, is because of many years of complete isolation from the international financial system, coupled with a regime that has just ruled to line its own pockets and not really caring about the well-being of the Iranian people. My own view is that sanctions have already accomplished as much as they possibly could in Iran, right? I mean, you're not going to sanction them one more step that's then going to lead to the regime to leave. And I think what that shows is that sanctions are quite a powerful tool, right? They're so powerful that you've got the Islamic Republic of Iran really on the brink of collapse, right? Probably these are the biggest threat to their regime that they've faced since 1979. But they're not a magic bullet. They're not going to be the single thing that winds up taking out the Islamic Republic. You are going to need a unified opposition, an opposition that is willing to sort of take on the Iranian powers, as well as some members of the security apparatus, like the IRGC, that potentially decide that it's not worth shooting on protesters, and then they need to switch sides. I think the thing I'm looking out for, I don't think this is over. From the perspective of the White House, I think Donald Trump was quite close to taking military action against Iran in the recent days, and it's very possible that comes back. So it's not out of the question that what has really been largely an economic war escalates into more of a military confrontation in the weeks ahead.
I think that's really interesting because he definitely, gave sort of solace to the protesters and said, we're going to come in there and if you kill anyone, and it seems, reports today of 16,500 people being killed in Iran, and yet nothing from America. You think it is possible that there still could be military action? And if so, what kind of action would that be, do you think?
I do. And I would sort of take the closest analogy here to Trump's strikes during his first term that killed Qasem Soleimani, then the head of the IRGC Quds Force in Iran. Trump does like these targeted strikes, these strikes where he basically shows that he can knock off leaders that sort of threaten his authority, threaten his power. And going back to those strikes several years ago, which actually happened in January as well, he was sort of taunted by Soleimani, by Ayatollah Khamenei, and that really led him to take action. So I would be looking at strikes. I think that take out some of the military capacity of the Islamic Republic. Of course, a lot of that was already eliminated last year in the Israeli and U.S. strikes in the spring. But there is still some missile launchers and whatnot that are left. But then I think the real sort of, wild card, and the thing that we all have to be looking at, would Trump take action against Ayatollah Khamenei himself? Would he go for a decapitation strike? And then sort of what would happen in the wake of that?
Yeah, I mean, I doubt he's planning on snatching him and parading him through the streets of New York, but who knows what might happen. But thank you very much there, Edward Fisher, joining us there, Director of the Centre on Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare.